Well, hello and welcome to everyone who is tuning in. After eight insightful sessions over the course of the last 2 years, spanning industry, sectors, and the economy, I am delighted to have with us Mr. Vivek Debroy, who will deliver the keynote address as a culmination to our Mint pre-budget roundtable series this year. Mr. Debroy, of course, needs no introduction. He is one of India's best-known economists and the Economic Advisory and chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, and has a ringside view of all that goes on in the economy and the economic landscape in the country. So, without further ado, sir, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mint, for inviting me. Since this is Mint, I cannot but resist the temptation to start with a limerick. The 5 trillion target seems difficult to get. We lost a couple of years amidst the pandemic fears. Now, Mint discusses a reset. The topic that we are discussing today is on the 5 trillion US dollars target. That target is expressed in US dollars. It is a target that is set in nominal terms. So therefore, it's important to remember that whenever we have got a target that is expressed in dollar terms, is expressed in nominal terms, when we reach it, is contingent also on what happens to the inflation rate, is contingent also on what happens to the exchange rate. For example, if the rupee appreciates vis-a-vis the US dollar, it will be a little bit easier to achieve that target. If the rupee depreciates vis-a-vis the US dollar, it will be a little bit more difficult to achieve that target. Depending on whatever one's assumptions are, one can sit down with a calculator, make one's assumptions about inflation, make one's assumptions about the exchange rate, and thereby deduce what kind of real rate of growth one requires to reach that 5 trillion US dollars GDP target. Depending on the assumptions one makes, and depending on the timeline one has in mind, because the 5 trillion target cannot be open-ended. If it is open-ended, at some point or the other, we will obviously achieve it. So depending on the timeline one has in mind, depending on the assumptions one makes about the inflation rate or the GDP deflator, depending on the assumptions one makes about inflation, something like about 5% inflation rate as in terms of the GDP deflator would be roughly reasonable, one will arrive at a target of real rate of growth of somewhere between 8 to 8.5%. When the 5 trillion target was first enunciated, Economics Survey did such an exercise and arrived at a real rate of growth of 8 to 8.5%, perhaps a little bit more. When we look at the target now, we need to realize the obvious, which is we lost 2 years as a result of the COVID pandemic. There was a decline in real GDP growth in 2020-21. I don't need to repeat the figures. And we do know that in 21-22, depending on who is making the forecasts, we will end the year 21-22 with a real GDP growth rate of around, let's say, 9.5%. This is not simply about the growth rates. This is also about the level of GDP. And the figures that have already surfaced suggest that not only has the growth rate this year, 21-22, been better, we have just about surpassed the level we had before the pandemic hit us. And the growth has been fairly robust across sectors. But all said and done, we have lost 2 years because of the pandemic. What we lost in 2020-21 is what we are about to recoup in 21-22. Some sectors, the contact intensive sectors, travel, tourism, some of the services, they are still suffering. They will recover in 22-23. We will soon know, the budget is not very far away, we will soon know what kind of real growth rate Finance Ministry and the government expects for 22-23. I'm inclined to think, because some of the contact intensive sectors, some of the service sectors will revive in 22-23, I'm inclined to think that in 22-23, we will get a real rate of growth of about 7.5%. And remember what I said earlier about something like 8.5% at least being necessary. The more important question to ask is, what is going to be the trajectory from 23-24? What kind of growth trajectory are we going to settle down on? Is it going to be 5.5%? Is it going to be 7.5%? Or is it going to be that aspirational level of 8.5%? Now remember, this is not just about the 5 trillion GDP target, because the GDP is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So we are also talking about the SDGs, which the world and India had to accomplish by 2030. So in terms of the SDG targets, indicators, and goals, the setback of 2 years was not only for growth, it was also in terms of accomplishing the SDGs. I should quickly add that while we are talking about growth, there are concerns, legitimate concerns about what is happening to the urban labor market. Because yes, growth has recovered, but there are still concerns about the labor market, particularly the urban labor market. And I also have in mind the declining work participation rates. This is not a new phenomenon. So far as the NSS is concerned, the declining work participation rate amongst women goes back to at least 1999. The declining male work participation rate goes back to at least 2004. There are several issues connected with the labor market. There are issues that are connected with the lack of skills, with the lack of correlation between education and skills. There are issues of the inefficient way labor markets operate, particularly in the informal sector, particularly in the unorganized sector. So a whole range of issues. But as of now, despite the robust growth recovery that I mentioned, there are legitimate concerns. Some of them are immediate short term, some of them are longer term, along the lines that I indicated, which mean that the labor market needs to be reformed. There has been a lot of talk about the present growth recovery being unequal. And I think we need to be a little bit careful. There will always be lags in the labor market recovery. When growth recovers, the labor market will recover with a bit of a time lag. But when we make comparisons and we make assertions about inequality, we should not make the obvious a stock with a flow. What do I mean by that? For example, I look at the wealth of people who have a certain amount of valuation in the capital market. That's a wealth. That's wealth. That's a stock. I cannot conceivably make a comparison between that stock and income, which is a flow concept. Having said this, what is it exactly that we are saying? Are we saying that inequality has been accentuated because of the pandemic and uncertainty connected with the pandemic? For all of India, I find that a very difficult proposition to accept. Since May 2014, this government has done a lot for the rural sector, which is also vindicated by something that Economic Survey computed, known as the Basic Necessities Index. It is not just Economic Survey. Something like the fifth version of the National Family Health Survey also establishes it. So it becomes very difficult for me to accept that inequality has increased all India across the board. Don't get me wrong, inequality exists, inequality has been a problem, but the assertion we are talking about is whether inequality has become accentuated as a result of the pandemic. This does not mean that there aren't concerns with the urban labor market. This is a concern I already flagged. The point I'm making is about inequality increasing across the board in India, and I need to quickly make the point that robust consumption expenditure distribution data that enable us to compute both inequality and poverty numbers, they do not exist after 2011-12. Having said this, let us move on a little bit. And one of the first points I want to make in this second part of it is that to deliver several goods and services, we need some form of identity. And one of the problems India faces is the lack of identity. Lack of identity in two senses. The first sense in which I'm using the expression lack of identity is identity for an individual. Now, immediately the reaction will be, come on, we already have identity for an individual. We have it in the form of Aadhaar. Of course we do. And many government programs, many policies, not just union government, also state government level, many of them now have Aadhaar embedded in them using the SECC. However, when one is talking about some schemes, such schemes and programs, there are some which are linked to households. MGNREGA is linked to households. SECC is linked to households. But there are others which are not linked to households, they are linked to individuals. Many of the health schemes. So there is an issue of now matching individual level identity with household level identity. And that matching exercise needs to be done before we can establish identity for every Indian or every resident of India. The second kind of identity, which is also important, and I will come back to this point again later, is identity for an enterprise. Typically, when we talk about enterprise, we have in mind the corporate sector. But all entrepreneurship is not in the corporate sector. There is also the MSME sector. And even before the pandemic, and even more so after the pandemic, the MSME sector has been through a considerable amount of churn. And one of the problems with the MSME sector is that the enterprise does not have an identity. Do remember that most MSME enterprises, more than 95% of them, are not registered under any piece of legislation. Be it, I'm not talking only about the Companies Act, that would be irrelevant in any case, but even other legal forms of establishment. Consequently, the second kind of identity issue is to establish identity for an enterprise, which is important for a whole variety of reasons. We probably have the beginnings of this through the GSTN numbers. I seem to have digressed a bit, at least I may have given the impression that I've digressed a bit. So let me come to the thrust of the issue, which is the 5 trillion target. When we look at this 5 trillion US dollar target, there are different ways to slice it. These are not silos because one impinges on the other, but there are different ways to slice that target. One way to slice this target is to do it in sectoral terms. Agriculture or the primary sector, industry, manufacturing or the secondary sector, the tertiary sector services. This is another possible way to slice it. That to get to that kind of 5 trillion target, to get to that kind of rate of growth of 8.5%, what kind of growth rate do we need in the primary sector? What kind of growth rate do we need in the secondary sector? What kind of growth rate do we need in the services sector? This is one kind of way to do it. The second kind of way to slice it is in terms of the 4 major drivers of economic growth. What kind of growth do we need for consumption? What kind of growth do we need for private investment? What kind of growth do we need for government expenditure? What kind of growth do we need for net exports? And let us remember that in the past, when India attained real GDP growth rates of 9% and more, the external world, the global world, was much more benign. For, again, reasons I need not reiterate, the external world today is not that benign. Yes, our exports have been doing well, but there are protectionist pressures. The WTO is in a bit of a limbo. So the kind of kindly environment that enabled us to get 9% plus rates of growth driven by exports is absent. I mentioned the growth recovery. Insofar as the growth recovery is concerned, however, exports have been doing reasonably well. Investments, I suspect, will react with a bit of a time lag once there is still excess capacity. Once that excess capacity eases, I suspect that investments will also begin to do pretty well. I said there are different ways of slicing. Yet another way, a third way of slicing is to slice it, and to me it's an important kind of slicing, is to look at it in terms of states. Because an 8.5% real rate of growth does not occur in Delhi, it occurs in the states. What happens all India is sigma, the aggregate of the states. If you leave out railways, national highways, telecom, defense, if you leave out those kinds of things, all growth actually happens at the level of the states. Depending on the year, 90 to 95% of national income originates in the states. And the point I'm making here is that notwithstanding what I said about the relatively unkind external environment, there is plenty of slack within states to drive that kind of rate of growth of 8.5% summed across the states. The last possible way to slice this is to slice it in terms of the classic factor inputs that economists have in mind, which is labor markets, land markets, capital markets, and the rest is productivity. So to get that kind of rate of growth, we need all three markets to be efficient. We need the labor market to be efficient. We need the land market to be efficient. We need the capital market to be efficient. And the rest of it, of course, is productivity. When I'm using the word capital market, obviously I'm using the word capital market in the economist sense, not in the loose sense that we sometimes refer to as the capital market. Efficiency in all of these requires partly free entry and free exit. The capital market is partly the province of the states. But certainly, when we come to land markets and labor markets, a large part of it is the province of the states. In the context of capital markets, competition requires not just entry but also exit. And exit not only for the corporate sector. I want to quickly mention the IBC. The IBC has been phenomenally successful. Its work in progress is just begun. We need to do things about NCLT and NCLAT. Having said that, it is a very important initiative to ensure exit of inefficient capital. But let me come back to land markets and labor markets. Labor is in the concurrent list in the Constitution. So far as the union government is concerned, the 50 plus labor codes have been now unified under 4 heads of wages, social security, safety, and industrial relations. But let me mention that there are a whole lot of labor laws that are outside the ambit of this unification. Take, for example, the Apprentices Act. Or alternatively, since I mentioned services, take the Shops and Establishments Act. Most services are under the Shops and Establishments Act. The Shops and Establishment Acts are state level acts. So we need to clean up the labor laws. Quite often people make comparisons with Bangladesh. I should perhaps mention that Bangladesh completely unified and cleaned up the labor laws and had a single employment code, which was introduced, if my memory serves me right, in the year 2006. So when we say, look at the phenomenal growth Bangladesh has achieved, look at the phenomenal kind of growth it has achieved in the textiles and garment sector, let us remember that labor laws had been completely cleaned up. Let me now come to land. When it comes to land, in many countries in Western Europe, even before the Industrial Revolution had happened, there was an enclosure movement, for example, in England. And we are talking about a situation here where land records are in abysmal shape. There are some states in India where the last cadastral surveys were held not even in the 1920s, they were held in the 1910s. There's been a lot of discussion about farmers. Any definition of farmer is contingent on ownership of agricultural land. If we do not have satisfactory land records, how on earth do we know what is the definition of farmer for the entire country? What does farmer mean? Yes, this is pegged on 5 trillion, but this also happens to be the year when last year, when we celebrated the 75th year of independence. And we're in the midst of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. And the Prime Minister has recently said that we should use, he said it several times, that we should use this as an opportunity to set a trajectory for ourselves for the year 2047. We need to get the building blocks in place for the year 2047 when we celebrate 100 years of independence. We need to set targets for that. Targets, for example, and I'm just citing these as examples, of, let us say, India moving into the upper middle income category with a per capita income of perhaps $4,500. Targets like using the UNDP's Human Development Index, India moving into the high human development category. In all of these, we need that kind of growth rate, 8.5% plus, perhaps even 9%, although 9% I personally believe is generally aspirational. Economists talk about markets. Markets do not function in isolation. Markets function in an institutional structure. They are determined by an institutional structure, which in the present case, of course, means the Constitution of India, which is the framework for all the laws that we have. The Constitution does not only talk about the executive wing of government, it talks also about the 3 organs of government, which are the judiciary and legislature also. And therefore, as part of our discourse, we need to bring in not only the executive, we need to bring in the judiciary, we need to bring in the legislature, and we also need to bring in these not only from the union government's point of view, but also from the point of view of state governments. Witness, for example, the amount of media attention and commentary attention that is devoted to the Union Finance Commission. Compared to that, how much of time do we spend discussing state level finance commissions? After all, when one is looking at the government, one is talking about the delivery of public goods and services. I'm not using the expression public goods and services entirely in an economist sense. I mean Paul Samuelson's sense. I'm using it in the sense of something that the government should do because the private sector will not deliver those goods and services. In terms of delivering those, we need a certain amount of decentralization of delivery because most public goods and services are not even delivered by state government, certainly not by union government, they're actually delivered by local government. Therefore, we need to also talk about state level finance commissions because there is a certain optimal level at which these public goods and services are optimally delivered. What I am implicitly talking about, of course, is the seventh schedule to the Constitution, which sets out these layers. In terms of moving towards that 5 trillion target, this particular discussion is happening at a time when economic survey is not very far away, when the union budget is not very far away. However, both the economic survey and the union budget needs to be set against this broad background of what we want the government to do. And there is, of course, a malign role that government can play in terms of excessive regulation, in terms of restricting entry. So while we need to curb that malign role of government, facilitate entry, facilitate competition, ensuring that the regulatory structures function efficiently, there is also a benign role for the government, which is in terms of what I've just said about subsidies. But to finance this, the government needs revenue. And that revenue primarily comes about through taxes. So, therefore, on the agenda, we need to talk about reform of taxation, a simplified direct tax code, removing exemptions, and also a GST. On the GST, I should mention this is not only about integration of more products and services under the GST framework, it's also about the GST rate. When GST was originally formulated, the revenue neutral rate was expected to be around 18%. Today, the average GST rate is about 11.5%. So that clearly is not tenable. 9%, 9.5% is potential. Potential energy does not automatically become kinetic energy. I said 9% is aspirational. But to get to that 8 to 8.5%, what we need to do is to ensure that four transitions that the country is going through right now are encouraged and are facilitated. What are these four transitions I have in mind? These four transitions I have in mind are a transition from rural to urban, a second transition from agriculture to non-agriculture, and within agriculture moving away from food grains to commercialization, diversification. The third kind of transition that we need to have is from the informal oblique unorganized to the formal organized. And the last transition that we have in mind, that I have in mind, is from subsistence level self-employment to more productive wage employment. The preamble to the Constitution begins, "We the people." In last year's speech delivered from Red Fort, the Prime Minister talked about Sabka Prayas. We will get to that 5 trillion target not only because of what government does, but because all of us as citizens will strive to ensure that we get towards that 5 trillion target. Sabka prayas. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and observations with us. We are indeed richer in our understanding of the challenges placed before the economy as we aspire to the $5 trillion target and the direction we're headed in after listening to you. To our viewers and readers who tuned into the sessions over the course of the last 2 days, and our esteemed panelists, thank you for being with us for the Mint Budget Roundtable 2022. All eyes now, of course, on Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's budget speech in the Parliament on February 1. Thanks once again for being with us.